The coalition fleet was dying and everyone knew it. Admiral Voss of the Kethari stood at the center of his command deck, watching the battle screens flash red one after another. 300 ships. 14 different species who had put aside centuries of old grudges to stand together against the Vreth Dominion. And right now, every single one of them was getting torn apart. The eastern flank had gone quiet 20 minutes ago. Not quiet like a ceasefire. Quiet like a graveyard. 40 ships had been over there. Now there was just debris floating in the dark, spinning slowly, catching the light of distant explosions. Voss had been a commander for 30 years. He had fought in border skirmishes, trade wars, and 2 full-scale conflicts. He knew what a losing battle looked like. He had seen that look on the faces of defeated commanders right before they made the call. That hollow, heavy look. He was starting to feel it himself. "Sir, the Western group is requesting permission to fall back," his comms officer said. The young Kethari's voice was steady but his hands were shaking. Voss did not answer right away. He looked at the map again. The Vreth formation was a wall. A slow, grinding, unstoppable wall. Their ships were dark-colored, almost invisible against the black of space except for the pulses of weapons fire coming off them in long bright lines. They did not rush. They did not take risks. They had been doing this for centuries and they were very, very good at it. They moved together like something alive. Like one single creature with hundreds of arms, all reaching forward at the same time. The coalition by comparison looked like a mess. Different ships from different worlds, built with different technology, following different battle doctrines. A Kethari cruiser moved nothing like a Selene fighter. A Brannick battleship communicated on different frequencies than a Tesheri destroyer. 14 species trying to fight as one, and the Vreth knowing exactly how to find every crack between them. "Sir," the comms officer said again. "I heard you," Voss replied. He walked slowly to the front of the deck and looked out through the main viewport. Out there in the black, a Selene carrier was burning. Long orange trails of fire were coming off its side even though there was no air and space to feed a flame. Something inside it was burning. Voss had served alongside the Selene captain of that ship. They had shared a meal 3 days ago. He did not let himself think about that right now. "Tell the Western group to hold position," he said quietly. "If they pull back, the center opens up and we lose everything at once." Nobody argued. But nobody looked confident either. The deck was tense in the way that only comes when trained soldiers start doing the math in their heads and do not like the answer they keep getting. Junior officers were pretending to look busy at their stations. Senior officers were standing very still, waiting. Everyone was waiting for Voss to do the thing no commander wants to do. Give the retreat order. Admit it was over. Start counting who was left and figure out how many could actually get out alive. Voss picked up the command pad. He pulled up the retreat protocol. His thumb hovered over it. Then the sensors went off. Not the usual kind of alert that rang during a battle. This was different. Sharper. The kind of sound the system made when it detected something it had never detected before. Every head on the deck turned toward the navigation station at the same time. "What is that?" Voss asked. His navigation officer, a young Kethari named Dale, was leaning forward with both hands on his console, staring at the readout like he was not sure he was reading it correctly. "Warp signature, sir," Dale said. "Unregistered. It is not Vreth. It is not matching anything in our database." "One of ours." "No, sir. None of the coalition members have ships in this sector. And the signature does not match any coalition drive type." Voss set down the command pad. He walked over and looked at the screen himself. The signature was unlike anything in the Kethari system files. The energy pattern was rough. Almost violent. Like whatever was coming through did not care much about doing it smoothly. "Could it be a malfunction?" someone asked from the back of the deck. "No," Dale said. "Something is coming through. Right now." The whole deck went still. Voss could hear the quiet hum of the ship's systems, the distant muffled sounds of the battle still happening outside, and nothing else. Everyone had stopped talking. Even the officers who had been quietly passing information back and forth had gone silent, all eyes on the navigation screen, watching the warp event grow stronger. "What is the hull configuration?" the tactical analyst asked, mostly to herself, pulling up the visual capture on her own screen. Nobody answered her. Nobody could. The ship that came through was not in any record. Not in the coalition archives. Not in the captured Vreth intelligence files. Not in any of the old explorer logs that went back 400 years. Whatever it was big. Bigger than most of what they had out there. And it was not pretty. It had none of the smooth design that most advanced species put into their warships. It looked almost rough. Heavy. built with no interest in elegance and every interest in not falling apart. Voss stared at the image on screen for a long moment. "Give me an ID," he said. Dale's fingers moved fast across the console. Pause. Then he looked up slowly. "Sir," he said. "The transponder code is coming through now." He hesitated. "It is human." The word landed on the deck like something dropped from a great height. A few officers exchanged looks. Some of them had only heard about humans secondhand. A small species from a single planet in an unremarkable system. They had made contact with the galactic community relatively recently. They had fought a couple of wars. Lost them from what the record said. Nobody had heard much about them since. Voss looked back at the screen. The human ship had not hailed anyone. Had not asked for a status report. Had not requested orders or tried to find out what the situation was. It had simply come out of warp, oriented itself and was now moving. Slowly at first. Then faster. It was heading straight toward the Vreth fleet. Alone. "Sir, should we hail them?" the comms officer asked. Voss watched the ship move on screen. Something about the way it moved felt different from any ship he had seen. Not graceful. Not elegant. Just steady. Like it had made up its mind before it even arrived. "Not yet," Voss said quietly. On the battle screen something strange was happening. The Vreth fleet, which had not stopped its advance for a single moment since the battle began, was slowing down. Their formation was not breaking. But it was pausing. Like something had caught their attention. And for the first time in 30 years of commanding, Admiral Voss did not reach for the retreat protocol. He just watched. The ship came through like it had somewhere to be. No slow emergence. No careful calibration. It punched out of warp the way something punches through a wall. Hard and fast and completely indifferent to how it looked doing it. The warp exit left a visible distortion in space around it, rippling outward like a shockwave, and when it cleared, there it was. Just sitting there. Real and solid and enormous. Every screen on Voss's command deck locked onto it at the same time. It was not a beautiful ship. That was the first thing anyone noticed. Most advanced civilizations, when they built warships, still put some thought into the shape. Smooth hull lines. Balanced weapon placement. A design that said, "We know what we are doing." This ship looked like someone had started with the question, what is going to hurt the most, and worked backwards from there. The armor plating was thick and uneven, layered in sections that did not quite match, like parts had been replaced after damage and nobody had bothered making it look clean. The weapon banks were not symmetrical. They were placed wherever they fit, wherever the engineers had decided they needed to go, with no concern for aesthetics. There were more of them than there should have been on a single hull. Way more. The ship was scarred. Not lightly. The hull told a story all on its own. Long deep gouges ran across the port side. Patches of newer metal sat next to older sections that had clearly been through things no repair crew could fully fix. Whatever this ship had been through before arriving here, it had not been easy. But it had survived. That was the thing. All that damage, all those scars, and it was still here. Still moving. Still intact. Burned into the hull in large letters that had clearly been repainted at least twice were the words nobody on the Coalition deck could immediately find in any language database. USCS Pale Vengeance. Dale read it out loud slowly. USCS Pale Vengeance. Nobody said anything for a moment. Inside the ship, it was loud in the way a working vessel always is. Vents pushing air. Systems humming. The quiet beep of instruments running their checks. The crew of the Pale Vengeance had been awake for 19 hours. Most of them had not slept well before that either. They had spent the last 4 days in FTL running calculations, checking weapons systems, running drills, and trying not to think too hard about what they were heading into. Captain Dale Rourke stood at the front of the bridge with his arms crossed and looked at the battle through the main viewport. He was not a tall man. Not particularly imposing to look at. He had short brown hair going gray at the sides, a jaw that always looked like it needed a shave, and eyes that were calm in the specific way that comes not from being relaxed but from having already made peace with the situation. He had been a naval officer for 22 years. He had served on 4 different ships. He had been through things that did not make it into official reports. He looked at the battle and read it fast. The Coalition was in bad shape. Their formation was fractured. Several ships were already gone. The Vreth were pushing hard from the north and east. It was the kind of situation that most commanders looked at and started planning a way out. Rourke looked at it and started planning a way through. His helmsman, Mike Travers, was already at his console running the approach calculations without being asked. Mike had been with Rourke for 6 years. He was younger, early 30s, with the kind of focused quiet that made him very good at his job. He did not need to be told what the captain was thinking. He usually already knew. Rourke watched the Vreth formation for another few seconds. He noted the spacing between their lead ships. He noted the angle of their advance. He noted where their fire was concentrated and where it was not. He filed all of it away quickly and without drama. Then he uncrossed his arms. "Take us in," he said. That was it. No speech. No announcement over the ship-wide comms. No dramatic pause. Just 2 words said quietly to the man at the helm, the way you might tell someone to take the next left turn. Mike's hands moved across the console without hesitation. "Yes, sir." The Pale Vengeance began to move. Out in the battle, something strange happened. The guns stopped. Not all at once. It happened in a wave. First, the ships closest to the human vessel's entry point stopped firing. Then the ones further back. It spread across the battlefield the way silence spreads through a crowd when something unexpected walks into the room. Within about 40 seconds, the entire battlefield had gone quiet. Coalition ships. Vreth ships. Everyone. It was not a ceasefire. Nobody had called one. There was no agreement. It was just that everyone on both sides had noticed the same thing at the same time. A single ship. Moving alone. Straight toward the Vreth fleet. No escort. No support. Not waiting for anything. On the coalition ships, officers were pulling up everything they had on human vessels and finding almost nothing useful. A few old records. Some grainy images from first contact. Basic technical specs that were clearly out of date. Whatever this ship was, whatever humans had built since those early files were written, the coalition did not have the data. On the Vreth ships it was different. The Vreth had been fighting wars for centuries. They had faced thousands of species. They had a process for assessing threats that was thorough and had never let them down. Their analysts were running scans on the Pale Vengeance right now, measuring the hull, cataloging the weapon systems, trying to build a threat profile. The numbers were coming back uncomfortable. The weapon density on that hull was not normal. The armor rating was above anything they had on file for a human vessel. And the ship was not slowing down. It was speeding up. On the Pale Vengeance bridge, nobody spoke. The crew worked. Weapons officers ran final checks. Engineers monitored the power distribution across the hull. The ship's doctor, a steady woman named Ann Briggs, had already set up the medical bay and was now standing in the doorway of the bridge watching the Vreth fleet grow larger on the main screen. She had volunteered for this mission knowing exactly what it was. They all had. Gunnery Chief Bobby Hess leaned back slightly in his seat and cracked his knuckles. He had been in 2 engagements before this. He had trained for a third for the last 18 months. He looked at the Vreth formation on his targeting screen the way a man looks at a math problem he has already solved once and is not worried about solving again. "Range?" Rourke asked. "4 minutes," Mike said. Rourke nodded once. Outside, the Vreth fleet still had not fired. Their formation had not broken. But it had shifted slightly. Unconsciously almost. The lead ships had pulled back a fraction. Not a retreat. Just a small adjustment. The kind a person makes when something walks toward them and they are not entirely sure what it is yet. They were used to being the thing that scared people. This was different. Admiral Voss watched from his command deck as the Pale Vengeance closed the distance alone, steady and unhurried. He realized he was holding his breath. Around him, every officer on his deck was doing the same thing. Nobody reached for a console. Nobody said a word. They just watched. 3 minutes out now. Still no communication from the human ship. No request for backup. No tactical coordination. No indication that Captain Dale Rourke had any interest at all in what anyone else thought about what he was doing. 2 minutes. The Vreth fleet finally moved. Their front line began to realign, turning weapons toward the approaching ship. They were getting ready. Running their calculations. Preparing the way they always prepared. Rourke watched them do it. He had expected this. He had planned for this. Every adjustment the Vreth made in the next few minutes, he and his crew had already talked through in the briefing room 3 days ago, drawing diagrams on a whiteboard and arguing about angles and timing until 2 in the morning. He looked at Mike. Mike looked back. Neither of them said anything. They did not need to. 1 minute out. The Pale Vengeance did not slow down. Far behind the front line on the Vreth command ship, Admiral Kreth sat in his command chair and watched the human vessel close the distance on his fleet's forward screen. He was old by Vreth standards. He had fought in more campaigns than most of his officers had been alive for. He had broken species that had been spacefaring for 1,000 years. He had watched proud fleets reduced to scattered wreckage in an afternoon. He had seen the moment, in battle after battle, when the enemy realized it was over. That specific moment when the fighting stopped being about winning and started being about surviving. He knew what that looked like. He had caused it more times than he could count. He was not used to being the one who felt uncertain. He pulled up the intelligence file on humanity again. He had read it before. He read it again now. It was not a long file. Humans were a young species. One planet. One star system. They had made contact with the wider galactic community less than 80 years ago, which by any measure was very recent. Their early technology had been rough. Their ships small. Their understanding of faster-than-light travel limited and borrowed heavily from species who had been doing it for centuries before them. The file noted 3 wars. The first had been against the Selene before the Selene joined the coalition. A border dispute that escalated. The humans had fought hard, but their ships were outmatched and their tactics were not built for the kind of engagement the Selene specialized in. They lost badly. Their fleet was pushed back to their own system. A peace agreement was signed that was not particularly favorable to humanity. Most species, after something like that, spend a generation recovering. Rebuilding slowly. Being careful. Humans spent about 4 years being furious and then got back to work. The second war had been against a mid-tier empire called the Gordati. Again the humans lost. Again it was not close. The Gordati had better weapons, better ships, and a century more experience in fleet combat. The humans took serious losses. Several of their newer ships were captured intact. Another unfavorable peace agreement followed. And then the third, which had been against the Vreth themselves. Kreth remembered that one. He had not commanded it personally, but he had followed it closely. Humanity had come in with more ships than before, better organized, clearly having learned some things from the previous 2 losses. It had not been enough. The Vreth had pushed through their defensive lines within 2 weeks. It had not even been a particularly difficult campaign by Vreth standards. The file noted that humanity had signed a non-aggression agreement after that third defeat and had gone quiet for nearly a decade. Kreth had assumed, as had most of the Vreth Strategic Council, that this meant humanity was finished as a military force. That they had learned their lesson. That they understood their place. He looked at the screen now. At the ship closing toward his fleet. Alone. Unescorted. Moving faster than it should have been comfortable moving toward a force this size. He thought about that decade of quiet differently now. Because on humanity's end, that decade had not been quiet at all. Lieutenant Carrie Walsh had spent most of it in a weapons research facility on Mars. She was not there because anyone ordered her to be. She had requested the posting herself, about 3 weeks after the battle, where she watched every other ship in her squadron get destroyed in under 6 minutes by Vreth weapons fire. She had been the only survivor because her ship had taken a hit that knocked out its drive and sent it spinning away from the main engagement, leaving her drifting and helpless while everyone around her died. She spent a long time thinking about those 6 minutes. She thought about the angles the Vreth had used, the order in which they had targeted the squadron, the specific weapons they had prioritized. She thought about the gaps in the human ship's armor that the Vreth seemed to know about. She thought about the way the Vreth formation had moved, fluid and coordinated, like they had run this exact scenario before because they probably had, against 100 other species who also had not survived it. Then she got to Mars and started taking apart every piece of captured Vreth weaponry the military had managed to recover. There was not a lot of it. The Vreth did not leave much behind. But there was enough. Enough to understand the principles. Enough to understand what made their weapons hit harder and faster than anything humans were currently building. She worked on it for 3 years. She brought in 2 other engineers, a physicist named Tom Garrett who specialized in energy systems, and a materials expert named Dave Purcell who had spent his career figuring out what kinds of metal could take punishment and what kinds could not. The 3 of them worked in a room that was not large enough and did not have good ventilation and had a coffee machine that broke every 2 weeks. What they built, eventually, was the weapons array on the Pale Vengeance. It was not pretty. It was not elegant. It was designed around one single idea, which was that if you are going to fight the Vreth, you need to be able to hurt them fast and keep hurting them faster than they can respond. Every weapon on that ship existed because Carrie Walsh had stood in a debris field where her friends had died and asked herself one question over and over. What would have changed those 6 minutes? On the engineering side, Ray Kowalski had come at the problem from a different direction. Ray had not lost a squadron. He had been on a ship that the Vreth boarded. A close-range engagement that went wrong fast, and ended with Vreth soldiers inside the hull moving through the corridors. Ray had spent 4 hours in that situation with a broken arm he had not had time to deal with, helping hold a section of the ship with whatever was available, which at one point had literally been a fire axe from the emergency locker on Deck 3. They had kept the ship. Barely. Ray walked away from that with a very specific understanding of what happened to a warship's systems when things went badly wrong. When power rerouting failed. When damage control protocols froze up because they were not built to handle multiple simultaneous critical failures. When the ship's automated responses were too slow or too rigid to deal with something the system had not been programmed to expect. He spent 6 years rewriting it. The damage response system on the Pale Vengeance was not the standard military software. It was something Ray had built mostly from scratch, tested by running simulations of the worst scenarios he could imagine, then making it worse, then running them again. The system could reroute power around 3 simultaneous hull breaches while maintaining weapons function. It could prioritize repair drones to the sections that mattered most in real time. It could keep the ship fighting through damage levels that would have shut down a standard vessel an hour earlier. He had named the software version 1.0 after the fire axe. Nobody outside his team knew that. The crew of the Pale Vengeance were not heroes in the traditional sense. They were not the best fighter pilots or the most decorated soldiers. They were people who had been in bad situations and had not looked away from what those situations taught them. They had spent years doing unglamorous, grinding, detailed work in facilities and labs and testing rooms, turning the experience of losing into something that could be used. When the call came for volunteers for this mission, the briefing had been straightforward. 1 ship. No backup. Objective was to engage the Vreth fleet long enough to change the momentum of the battle. The officer giving the briefing had been honest that the odds were not comfortable. He had said anyone who did not want to volunteer would face absolutely no consequences. This was not the kind of mission anyone could be ordered into. Every single person in that room had raised their hand. Not because they were trying to be brave. Bravery is something you feel in the moment, sudden and sharp. This was different. This was something quieter and harder. This was people who had specific memories they carried with them every day, of specific moments where things had gone wrong and people had not come home, and who had decided a long time ago that they were going to do something about it. Admiral Kreth looked at the intelligence file one more time. Then he looked at his screen. The human ship was 1 minute out now. He closed the file. He had a feeling it was out of date. The first shot came from the Vreth left flank. It hit the Pale Vengeance on the forward port side and the whole ship shuddered like something alive. On the bridge, officers grabbed their consoles. A junior systems monitor named Pete Adler went sideways out of his chair and hit the floor and was back up in about 2 seconds, already checking his screen before he had fully straightened up. The lights flickered once and held. Rourke did not move. He stood at the front of the bridge with his feet apart and his hands behind his back and watched the Vreth formation on the main screen like he was reading a map. "Report," he said. "Forward armor took it. No breach. Power systems nominal." Mike Travers called from the helm without looking up. "Good. Keep us moving." And that was the beginning of it. What followed was not the kind of battle that looks clean in recordings. There was no elegant maneuvering. No perfectly executed formations. It was loud and fast and constantly changing, and the only reason the Pale Vengeance stayed in one piece through the first 10 minutes was because every single person on that ship had been trained for exactly this kind of chaos and had made a personal decision, somewhere before this day, that they were not going to fold when it arrived. The Vreth came in hard from 3 directions. That was their standard opening. They had used it against hundreds of fleets. Split the enemy's attention, forced them to choose which threat to respond to, then hit hardest from the direction they chose to ignore. Against a coalition fleet it worked consistently because different species prioritized differently and the coordination always broke down under pressure. Against one ship it should have worked even easier. Rourke had expected it. He had drawn this exact scenario on the whiteboard in the briefing room 4 days ago. He had pointed at the 3 vectors and told his crew what he was going to do about it and watched their faces go through the same sequence. First uncertainty. Then the slow realization that it might actually work. Then the kind of grim acceptance that comes when you understand that the plan is unusual but the person explaining it clearly believes in it and that counts for something. He split the weapon systems into 3 independent firing groups and assigned each one a vector. Bobby Hess ran the primary group from the gunnery station, a big steady man who had grown up working on his family's farm in rural Ohio before joining the Navy, and who approached the weapons console the way he had approached every difficult physical task in his life, which was with complete patience and zero drama. He did not get rattled. That was his most valuable quality right now. The secondary group was handled by a weapons officer named Lisa Trent, who was 28 years old and had qualified top of her class in targeting systems and had spent the last year specifically studying Vreth ship armor, learning exactly where it was weakest and what angle of impact caused the most damage. She had a list in her head. She worked through it methodically. The third group was on manual backup from the start because Ray Kowalski had told Rourke 2 days ago that the automated targeting on the portside rear bank had a lag that he had not been able to fully fix and that in a real engagement it would cost them. So Rourke had put Jake Fuller on it. Jake was 25 and had the fastest manual input speed of anyone on the ship, a fact that had come out during a casual competition in the break room 3 weeks ago and had turned out to be more relevant than anyone expected. For the first 7 minutes the ship took hits and kept moving and kept firing and did not stop. Deck 4 took a direct strike that collapsed a section of the corridor network and knocked out 2 secondary power lines running through that part of the hull. Ray had rerouted around both of them before the damage report finished printing. The repair drones were already moving. Comms went down the first time when a hit disrupted the signal relay on the upper hull. It was back up in 90 seconds because the backup relay was something Ray had insisted on adding during the refit, over the objections of 2 different project managers who said it was redundant weight. It went down a second time when a second hit took out the primary comms board entirely. That one took 4 minutes. During those 4 minutes Rourke ran the bridge on hand signals and direct verbal orders, which worked because his crew had drilled for it and because the bridge was not that large and everyone could hear him clearly. Then the targeting system failed. It did not fail completely. It flickered. Lost resolution. Began feeding coordinates with a half-second delay that in a fast engagement was enough to make every shot land wrong. Bobby Hess noticed it before the system flagged it, because he had been watching the outputs and something felt off. He ran a fast check, confirmed the lag and made a decision in about 3 seconds. He switched to manual. He called coordinates out loud. Clear and steady, the way someone reads a list, no urgency in his voice even though the ship was being hit every 90 seconds and the deck was vibrating under his feet. Jake Fuller punched them in by hand at the secondary console, his fingers moving fast and precise, repeating each coordinate back in a low voice to confirm before he locked it in. It was slower than the automated system on a good day. But the automated system was not having a good day, and Bobby Hess calling numbers out loud in a calm voice was faster and more accurate than a compromised computer running degraded. They kept firing. Outside, the Vreth were adapting. They always adapted. That was what made them dangerous over a long engagement. They read the battlefield continuously and adjusted. Their commanders were communicating constantly, sharing targeting data, updating formation positions, looking for the pattern in how the human ship was moving and firing so they could find the gap in it. They found what they thought was a gap on the right flank. The Pale Vengeance had concentrated its fire forward and slightly left for the last 3 minutes. The right side had been quieter. The Vreth read that as a weakness, possibly damage, possibly a system issue. They began moving 3 destroyers into a flanking position on that side, wide and fast, curving around to come in from an angle that would put them behind the human ship's main weapons arc. It was a good move. Against most ships it would have worked. Rourke watched them do it on the tactical screen. He had been watching the Vreth formation the entire fight, not just his own ship's status but the enemy's movement, looking for exactly this. He had kept the right side quieter on purpose. Not weak. Quiet. There is a difference. He waited until the 3 destroyers had committed to the arc. Until they were moving fast and confident and had passed the point where they could easily reverse. Then he said 2 words. Hard right. Mike did not hesitate for even a fraction of a second. He was already moving as the words came out. The Pale Vengeance turned directly into the flanking attack. Not away from it. Into it. Full speed, heading straight at the 3 destroyers that were expecting to come around behind a ship that would be moving away from them. The Vreth targeting systems had not modeled this. They were built on centuries of engagement data against hundreds of species and not one of those species had ever responded to a flanking maneuver by accelerating directly into it. The calculation for what to do when your flanking formation suddenly has a heavily armed warship coming straight at them at full speed had simply not been a scenario anyone had programmed for because it was not a rational thing to do. The 3 destroyers broke formation instantly. 2 of them pulled hard in opposite directions. The third, caught between the moves of the other 2 and its own emergency evasion, clipped the second destroyer along the rear section. The impact was not catastrophic but it knocked both ships off their vectors and sent them spinning for a full minute before they regained control. The third destroyer had pulled so wide trying to avoid everything that it was completely out of the engagement for the next several minutes. 3 ships. Gone from the fight. Not destroyed. Just removed by a move that had no business working. On the Coalition command deck Admiral Voss was standing with both hands on his console, leaning forward, watching. He had stopped thinking about his own fleet situation for the last several minutes. He could not look away. The Vreth line was still intact. Still dangerous. The Pale Vengeance was damaged in several places and running on backup systems in at least 2 sections. This was not over. But something had changed. The Vreth were reacting to the human ship now. Instead of pushing forward, they were watching it, adjusting to it, trying to solve it. And the more they adjusted, the more gaps they left in the parts of their formation that had been holding the coalition back. Slowly, one small fracture at a time, the Vreth line began to come apart. It ended quietly. That was the strange part. The whole battle had been noise and fire and constant movement for what felt like much longer than it actually was. And then, over the course of about 4 minutes, the Vreth fleet simply stopped. Their forward ships pulled back first. Then the flanks. Then the rear formation began turning, slowly and in order, not panicked, not chaotic, because the Vreth did not panic. They were too disciplined for that. But they were turning. All of them. Away from the battlefield. Away from the coalition fleet. Away from the single human ship sitting in the middle of the wreckage. And then they jumped. One by one, and then in groups, the Vreth ships folded into FTL and disappeared. Each jump left a brief distortion in space, a ripple that faded fast, and then there was just empty dark where a warship had been. It happened quickly once it started. Within 3 minutes, the Vreth fleet, which had been tearing the coalition apart an hour ago, was simply gone. The battlefield went completely silent. On the coalition command deck, nobody spoke for a long moment. Officers stood at their stations and stared at screens that were showing them something none of their historical records had ever shown before. A Vreth retreat. Not a tactical repositioning. Not a strategic withdrawal to a secondary line. A full retreat from an active engagement. There was no precedent for it in any database any of them had access to. Scholars who had spent careers studying Vreth military history had written extensively about the fact that the Vreth did not retreat. It was not stubbornness or pride. It was simply that in all their centuries of warfare they had never encountered a situation that made retreat the logical choice. Until today. Admiral Voss straightened up slowly from his console. He looked around at his officers. They were all looking back at him with the same expression, a kind of stunned, exhausted disbelief, like people who had been bracing for an impact that never came and were not quite sure yet that it was really over. He looked at the main screen. The Pale Vengeance was still there. It was not in good shape. Even from this distance the damage was visible on the scans. 9 hull breaches. The repair drones were already working on the most critical ones, but the ship was venting atmosphere from 2 sections that had not been sealed yet. One of the main engines was completely cold, shut down either from damage or as a precaution, leaving the ship running on the remaining drives at reduced capacity. Roughly half the external lighting was out, which on a ship that size meant large sections of the hull were dark, giving it a strange half-lit appearance against the debris field around it. The debris field itself told the story of the last hour. Wrecked Vreth ships. Pieces of hull plating. Destroyed weapons systems. All of it floating slowly in every direction the way wreckage does when there is nothing left to hold it in place. The Pale Vengeance sat in the middle of all of it, motionless now, like something that had walked through a storm and stopped on the other side. But it was there. Inside the ship it was very quiet. The kind of quiet that comes after something intense when the body starts to understand that the immediate danger has passed and begins the slow process of catching up with everything it pushed aside during the fight. Crew members sat at their stations or stood in corridors and did not say much. Some of them were running system checks. Some of them were helping with repairs. Some of them were just sitting still for a minute, which they had earned. Bobby Hess was still at the gunnery station. He had not moved from that seat in over an hour. He sat back now and looked at the ceiling and let out a long, slow breath. His hands, which had been moving constantly for the last hour calling coordinates and running manual targeting, were finally still. He turned them over once and looked at them like he was checking that they were still his. Jake Fuller was asleep in his chair. He had been awake for 22 hours, and the moment the adrenaline left his system his body simply shut down. Nobody woke him up. He had earned it more than most. Lisa Trent was going through her targeting logs methodically, noting what had worked and what had not, already thinking about what she would write in her debrief report. That was how she processed things. She needed to understand the numbers before she could fully feel anything else. Ray Kowalski was down in engineering with 3 of his team members, moving through the damaged sections with a tablet and a flashlight, assessing everything personally. He would not stop until he had walked every compromised section himself and confirmed what the drones were telling him. He did not fully trust any system he had not looked at with his own eyes when it mattered. And Briggs had been in the medical bay for the last 40 minutes. There were injuries. None of them critical, which under the circumstances was something close to a miracle given what the ship had gone through. She was thorough and quiet and moved between her patients without rushing, which was the thing injured people needed most from a doctor. Someone who was not panicking. Captain Dale Rourke had not left the bridge. He stood at the front of it the same way he had stood there for the entire engagement. The same posture. The same calm. He was looking at the viewport, at the debris field, at the empty space where the Vreth fleet had been. He did not look triumphant. He did not look relieved exactly. He looked like a man who had done a job and was now quietly accounting for all of it. The cost of it. The weight of it. Mike Travers looked over at him from the helm. "Sir," he said quietly. "Coalition Command is hailing us." Rourke stood still for another few seconds. Then he nodded once. "Put them through." The voice that came through was Admiral Voss. His translator rendered his words into clear English, which the Pale Vengeance systems had been configured for since the mission briefing included the possibility of coalition contact. Voss sounded like someone who was choosing his words carefully, not because he did not know what to say but because what he wanted to say felt too large for normal language. "Captain Rourke," he said. "This is Admiral Voss of the Ketheri Coalition Command. I am speaking on behalf of the Allied fleet." He paused. "We are standing by to render whatever assistance you require." Rourke nodded slowly to himself. "Appreciated, Admiral. We have the situation under control. Some hull work and we will be operational." There was a brief silence on Voss's end. Then he spoke again, and this time the careful formality dropped slightly. He sounded like someone asking a question they genuinely needed the answer to. "Captain, how did you know you could win?" The bridge of the Pale Vengeance was very quiet. A few officers looked up from their stations. Nobody made a sound. The question sat in the air of the bridge and everyone on it understood why Voss was asking. Because from the outside, from the perspective of every other species watching, what the Pale Vengeance had done made no rational sense. One ship against a fleet. No backup. No guarantee. No logical foundation for the confidence it would have taken to make that call. Rourke was quiet for a long moment. In that silence you could hear the ship. The hum of the remaining engines. The distant sound of repair drones working. The soft beep of instruments still running their checks. The breathing of a tired crew that had gone through something together that most people never go through at all. Rourke looked at the viewport one more time. At the debris field. At the dark empty space where the Vreth had been. Then he spoke. "We didn't," he said. His voice was flat and quiet and completely honest. "We just knew we weren't gonna lose twice." The channel stayed open. Voss did not respond immediately. On his end, on every coalition ship that was patched into that frequency, officers and commanders and crew members from 14 different species sat with those words and turned them over. Trying to understand them fully. Trying to find the bottom of what they meant. Because it was not a boast. That was the thing. It was not confidence or arrogance or the kind of thing someone says when they know they are going to win. It was something simpler and much harder. It was the statement of people who had lost, badly, more than once and had made a decision about what that meant. Not that they would definitely win next time. Just that they would not accept losing the same way again. That they would do something about it. That they would remember and work and change and come back different. That was all it was. And somehow that was the most serious thing anyone on those coalition ships had ever heard. The channel stayed open for a long time. Nobody closed it. Nobody on either end had anything to add to what had just been said, and everyone understood instinctively that anything added would only make it smaller. Outside in the quiet debris field, the Pale Vengeance sat still. Battered. Dark in places. Broken in others. But there. Still there.